Hello, welcome to the Western Resource Advocates webinar, Colorado River Basin Interim Guidelines Negotiations, a historic moment for the Colorado River. I'm Jenna Nava, Communications Manager at WRA and the Zoom webinar host for our event today. Just a few reminders before we jump in. The webinar today will be 1 hour. While the format is mostly Q&A between our moderator and panelists, we will be taking questions from our audience via Zoom's Q&A function, which will show up as a Q&A icon in the bottom center of your screen. While we may not be able to get to all the questions, we will try to follow up as needed if we can't get to your specific questions today. We have also enabled closed captioning. That feature should show up as an icon at the bottom of your screen as well, and you should be able to select it to turn it on and off throughout the webinar as you see fit. Also, this webinar is being live streamed to WRA's Facebook and LinkedIn pages and recorded. We will send everyone who is registered, whether in attendance or not today, the recording within the next couple days. Before I turn this over to our moderator, I'd first like to thank our sponsors for today's event. First up, our premier sponsor, Vision Ridge Partners, which aims to deliver superior financial returns and positive environmental impact through investments in sustainable real assets. Our signature sponsors include Denver Water, First Bank, Kind Design, Scarpa, and the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. As a nonprofit, our work depends on donations and partnerships with businesses, organizations, and individuals throughout our region and beyond. Our generous sponsors and supporters allow WRA to bring you this important programming and resources like today's webinar to share innovative solutions to the region's most pressing conservation challenges. I encourage you to visit westernresourceadvocates.org/donate to learn how you can support on-the-ground solutions to climate change. With that, I will turn this over to our moderator, Orla Bannon. Orla is WRA's Strategic Engagement Manager for the Healthy Rivers Program. Orla works to address water scarcity issues in Colorado by encouraging regional water boards to adopt conservation-oriented management approaches and by helping emerging leaders in local communities get more involved in water decision-making. Orla?
Thanks so much, Jen, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion with our panelists. Before we get started, I would like to give everyone a quick overview of the interim guidelines, why they need to be renegotiated, and why they are important. So, what are the Colorado River Basin interim guidelines? For a century, Colorado River's water has been divvied up and governed by the law of the river, which is a collection of legal agreements, compacts, court decrees, international decisions, and congressional acts. The foundation of the law of the river is the Colorado River Compact of 1922, which divided the basin into the upper and lower basins. Subsequent decisions dictate what share of the river the different states and water users, including Mexico, are entitled to throughout the Colorado River Basin. The fundamental challenge is that decision-making in the past 100 years has over-allocated the river, meaning that there are more demands on the river each year than there is water that is physically available. By the turn of the 21st century, increasing demands were overcoming available supplies, which were reduced even more by years of low snowpack and extreme drought. In 2007, the Colorado River Basin states and the federal government negotiated a set of guidelines to update how we manage the river together as a region. For 15 years, the interim guidelines have coordinated water releases from Lake Powell and Lake Mead to provide more certainty for Colorado River water users, intending to avoid mandatory curtailments and provide more certainty for Colorado River water users among the upper and lower basin states. The guidelines also included prescriptions for how the lower basin states would be curtailed in their annual allocation, depending on Lake Mead elevation levels. Because coordinated operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead and potential shortages in the lower basin were new for the basin states and the federal government, they created an interim agreement so that managers and decision makers could take lessons learned and apply them to a new agreement starting in 2026. So why do the guidelines need to be renegotiated? As Colorado River experts have noted, climate change has come barging through the front doors of the Colorado River Basin. Now is a pivotal moment for upper and lower basin states alike to start planning for a future where the Colorado River has less water. Increased temperatures and the lasting impacts of drought on soil moisture mean that near average levels of snowpack in the last few years have resulted in below average flows in the Colorado River. Much of the rain and snowpack that used to make it into rivers just doesn't anymore. In 2019, additional steps were taken to implement a drought contingency plan in both the upper and lower basin. Faced with steeply declining levels at Powell in 2021, the Bureau of Reclamation released water from federal reservoirs in the upper basin to help stabilize levels in Powell. On the way down, these releases benefited flows for federally endangered fish, river recreation, and hydropower revenues. Last August, the federal government announced the first ever Tier 1 shortage in the lower basin, which triggers cutbacks on water in Arizona, Nevada, and Mexico, primarily to agricultural producers. And then just last month, the US Senate held a committee hearing to examine short and long-term solutions to extreme drought in the Western US. Bureau of Reclamation Commissioner Tootin testified to the committee that states within the region would need to conserve between 2 to 4 million acre feet in 2023 to protect critical levels at Meade and Powell. Despite best efforts and good intentions of the original interim guidelines, it is clear that they are not enough to keep the river system from crashing. So why are the interim guidelines important? Well, the Colorado River provides drinking water to over 40 million people, irrigates 5.5 million acres of farmland, is home to 30 indigenous communities, supports a $75 billion recreation economy, and sustains 30 endemic fish species and critical river habitat for the millions of birds using the Pacific Flyway. Communities in 7 states and northern Mexico all depend on the Colorado River for water. Impacts from the climate crisis are only adding to the pressure on the river and the life it supports. The Colorado River Basin has been experiencing a historic mega drought for the past 20 years. The amount of water actually flowing in the river is significantly less than throughout the 20th century when the law of the river was developed. It's clear that robust and resilient management agreements are more important than ever. The renegotiation of the interim guidelines provides a historic opportunity to protect and reset the equilibrium of the Colorado River. Cities, communities, industries, and agriculture interests, among others, will be vying to protect their share of the Colorado River's water. Western resource advocates and our partners are working to ensure the Colorado River, its ecosystems, world-class recreation opportunities, and surrounding communities are protected now and for future generations. Western Resource Advocates is committed to seeing an equitable and sustainable agreement reached by advocating for water-conscious and cost-effective solutions. That will require working with decision makers, thought leaders, water managers, indigenous leaders, state legislators, and communities to encourage water-smart policies and shape the way the interim guidelines are updated. So let's touch quickly on the process for renegotiating the interim guidelines. The initial steps for renegotiation of the interim guidelines have already begun. Under the National Environmental Policy Act, the Bureau of Reclamation will prepare an environmental impact statement and conduct a robust public input process. In order to enact new guidelines, federal legislation will be required. Throughout all these steps, the basin states, federal agencies, tribes, non-governmental organizations, and other stakeholders will be in ongoing discussions about the proposed interim guidelines. Thank you. Now I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists. So welcome, Mark Harris. Mark is the General Manager of the Grand Valley Water Users Association in Grand Junction, Colorado. Mark has been involved in the agricultural business for most of his life. Under Mark's leadership, the association has been actively involved in drought contingency, resiliency, conservation planning, and demand management issues. Mark has been a leader in not just the Grand Valley, but Western Colorado and the whole Colorado River Basin in trying to figure out how agriculture can get ahead of some of our current water challenges and helping develop strategies to keep agriculture viable in a drier future. We are happy also to welcome Heather Tanana today. Heather is a citizen of the Navajo Nation and a assistant research professor at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. Heather is experienced in state, federal, and tribal courts and clerked at the U.S. District Court for the District of Utah. She also founded the Indian Law Section of the Utah State Bar Association. Her career has been driven by her personal commitment to serving her people. Heather's research interests include addressing the wide gap in drinking water access for Native American communities. Welcome also to Colby Pellegrino. Colby is the Deputy General Manager of Resources for the Southern Nevada Water Authority and the Las Vegas Valley Water District. After joining the agency in 2003, Colby served as an instrumental part of the Water Resources Division, supporting Colorado River modeling efforts to anticipate changes caused by climate change, reduced flows, and other inputs. She also serves on the Board of Alliance for Water Efficiency, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the efficient and sustainable use of water and water conservation advocacy throughout North America. And thanks to John Bergren for joining us today. John is a water policy analyst for Western Resource Advocates, where he works to advance water conservation and efficiency policies at the regional, state, and local levels by engaging with municipalities, water managers, state officials, and other stakeholders throughout the region. Much of this work is at the intersection of water and land use planning, with the hopes of helping communities become as efficient as possible. So let's start with a question for all the panelists. So given the quick introduction and looking at where we are today, how serious is this moment that we are facing in the Colorado River? Heather, would you like to get us started?
Yeah, thanks. And Nyate, everyone, happy to be here. So I think most of us probably who are joining today are well aware Colorado River is shrinking, right? American Rivers earlier this year declared it the most endangered river. And folks like, John Fleck, Jack Schmidt, they've been sharing their hydrology models for years. And the Natural Climate Assessment right now is undergoing its 5th report. The first one came out over 20 years ago in 2000, and again identified the climate change impacts to water, and that here in the West, every year we're increasingly facing less and less water, which then has quality impacts and other concerns. So it's clear, right? We can't sit idly. These conditions are not going to improve on their own. For me, one of the things I think is the biggest challenge is really bringing this issue to the forefront. Those of us here are aware of it, who work in the field, but what about everyone else? If you haven't caught John Oliver's segment about water security in the West, I thought he did a really great job of highlighting the different challenges. And so I think we need to outreach more so that, again, not just the experts are aware of the challenges, but everyone, because the solution is going to require everyone.
Thank you for that, Heather. Really appreciate it. Mark, what are your thoughts on how serious this moment is?
Well, I can't add much to Heather's comments there. I think probably for many of us, we probably can't even quite internalize how bad things are. We've known over time, probably in the last few years, that things have been worse than we were ready to or able to admit. So it's quite serious. I would just confirm what Heather said, that we're becoming aware of just how serious it is today.
Colby, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think I would just say, we're at a fundamental crossroads, and kind of like Mark said, we've known the problem was serious. The reservoirs are finally low enough that we have to do something about it. I think we're at a crossroads for action, but I think we're also at a crossroads for cooperation, because if the water users are unwilling to stand up realistic things to get our use in line with what Mother Nature is providing us, we're going to find ourselves for the first time in a situation where the secretary is having to manage the system much differently and uncooperatively.
Serious times indeed. John, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I guess, just echoing what's been said, but about us knowing about this challenge for decades now, but what I think would signifies how serious the moment is the scale of conservation that is needed that the commissioner announced just last June, that Orla that you highlighted. When we're talking 2 to 4 million acre feet of additional conservation by next year, that's a state level allocation of scale. So California gets 4.4 million acre feet of Colorado River water, Arizona 2.8. Here in the Upper Basin, we use, on average 4 to 4.5 million acre feet per year. So when we're talking 2 to 4 million acre feet of additional conservation being needed in the next year, that scale represents how fundamental the system is in crisis and how much we need to change it. And so I think that represents how serious this is. And the other thing I would note is I think it's a great example of the impacts of climate change that we're seeing on the ground here in the Colorado River Basin. This is the 3rd year in a row of fishing closures in the upper Colorado due to warm temperatures. We just learned a month or 2 ago that there's now smallmouth bass in the Grand Canyon that were going through Glen Canyon Dam because reservoir levels were so low that they could get through the turbines. And that has huge implications for the humpback chub in the Grand Canyon. And so, as you noted in your intro, Orla, the climate change has come barging through the front doors of the Colorado River Basin. I think that's our friend Jennifer Pitt who said that. I think she's spot on, and it really shows this global challenge of climate change and how it's playing out here in the Colorado River Basin.
Great, thanks, John. So, Mark, I'm going to pitch a question to you in face of sort of the challenges, the scale of the challenge that are needed. What do you think needs to change in order to correct some of the systemic challenges in our management of the river?
Well, or I can't tell you how I appreciate you leading off with that question. So thanks a lot. But regarding the old advice regarding fools and angels, here goes. And I need to admit, I'm in no position, as some of the rest of the panelists are, and many of the people that are listening today, to make quantitative suggestions about, some of the important micromanagement of some of these river management issues. But I will share some personal thoughts that have been informed by the involvement of the water users and discussions in the Upper Basin, to a limited extent in the Lower Basin, and the activities and experiences that we've had the luxury to participate in. And hopefully this will tee up some of the ensuing conversation. I also need to recognize that many of you have as much or more experience than I or the water users do about these issues. So I don't know that I can offer anything new necessarily that you haven't discussed already, but I can share, and in some cases confirm, what we're hearing from our constituencies. And as you would expect, as an Upper Basin water user and manager, we do believe that the continued recognition of the role of the Lower Basin in addressing the overall increasing demands on water supply and the reservoirs is obviously fundamental to fair, productive, and sustainable 2026 guidelines. We do realize, however, that we all have our own set of water and weather-related challenges in each of our operations, our farms, our ranches, our organizations, regardless of where we are in the basin. And changes in river management writ large are going to have to be supported by localized changes in thinking and action. So therefore, water users, both those of us who are consumptive users and many of our partners who are non-consumptive users, are going to have to totally accept the fact that it's no longer business as usual. And that's been difficult for many of us to do. And the solutions to our systemic water problems are not going to come from a pleasant change in the water and weather trends. Those days, I think many of us have finally are dealing with. We've had a hard time accepting some of those new facts of water life. We have to realize them. We have to understand that many of the appropriate needs of others have to be recognized, and that the solutions perhaps are going to be somewhat painful, but they're going to be optimal and survivable on balance in river management. Collaboratively may be our only salvation. So we would suggest that no matter what economic or resource community you find yourselves in, and it's usually several, we can no longer expect to eventually manage our way out to a way that we fulfill all of our water needs and aspirations we're likely going to have to pick and choose those operations that we think are the most important for us to continue with. And as an agricultural water user and water provider that's deeply involved, as many of our partners are, in stream flow and endangered fish recovery activities, I would also suggest that the address of these and other environmental challenges cannot be assumed to come automatically from agriculture, as we know that our needs can't automatically come from the environment. Those days are gone. So the ongoing search for a workable 2026 set of guidelines requires recognition of mutually competing needs for a diminishing natural resource. Again, it's nothing new, but hopefully our continued discussion about that fact and the collaboration that Colby mentioned will lead us to better policy decisions. I'll stop there, and maybe we can follow up with any questions that people have later. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think tough decisions and a lot of collaboration needed to build on what Colby was saying. And then, you mentioned the environment and looking forward to how other interests might be thought of in this 2026 guidelines. So thinking of that, the compact's 100 years old, and, does it necessarily reflect today's values and interests? So Colby and John, I'd love to hear from you about how you think we incorporate more of the modern values and interests, including the river ecosystems themselves, into the river management as we look to 2026. And Colby, maybe you can start us off on that one.
It's going to sound silly, but I think the first step in having a more holistic and modern management regime is for people to understand the math. I get asked all the time, how did we get here? This is such a surprise. It's not. In any given year, there's 14 to 15 million acre feet of use basin-wide. And the long-term average of this drought is 12.3. The last 5 years have produced less than 11. Add up those numbers, that's the water missing from Lake Powell and Lake Mead. We have just been complacent on acknowledging the math problem for the last 20 years while we watch the reservoirs drop. But as we sit in these multi-stakeholder meetings over and over and over again, the conversation on equity, there's a distinct have and have-nots as far as a seat at the table, the feeling like you're incorporated, and the notion that everyone is being treated with equity. And we cannot move beyond that until everybody recognizes the problem. There's no new water to give out. There is no one that we can make whole without taking water from somewhere else. And Mark's point is very valid. Agriculture cannot be the solution to all of the equity problems on the river, to solving all the tribal water rights settlements, to creating all the habitat flows that we want to create. But the reality is the basin needs to be using 30% less water than it's using today. So nothing additional comes at the expense, just from nature. It's not there. Every additional use has to come at the expense of somebody using less water. And I think we're never going to have equity until every single person participating in the conversation acknowledges how gargantuan this problem is right now.
Thanks, Colby. John, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. This idea of how do we reflect today's values in our river basin management. And that's why despite some of the, as Colby just mentioned, gargantuan challenges we face, I do also think that this is kind of a historic generational opportunity to revisit our prioritization of our values on this river system and really think through how do we update the river's management to reflect 2022 values. As you noted, the 1922 compact over 100 years ago reflected the values then. And so now we need to think about how do we actually reflect our values that we have here in today's society. And so, and of course, including that is the river itself and protecting ecological integrity and functionality. That's not something that was considered back in 1922. And so thinking through ways to do that, I think there's one example, the recent Drought Response Operations Agreement, or DROA, that was part of the 2019 Upper Basin DCP, that required releasing additional water from upstream reservoirs down the Lake Powell. You know, if you think about how those additional releases happen, when they happen, and you coordinate with the key agencies overseeing those reservoirs and the some of the endangered species programs that Mark mentioned, you can actually benefit environmental flows as you're responding to these emergency drought conditions with these new operations. And so that's one way. And then just as Colby mentioned, there's more folks are coming to the table and providing input. And I think that's another way to really reflect our current values, is making sure that this is an open participatory process that environmental NGOs, recreation groups can bring their values to the conversation in a way that is productive and helps us better reflect, again, our 2022 values into that decision making.
Yeah, and I just add, I think that really highlights this challenge that not everyone agrees on what the values or interests should be prioritized and protected. And we've historically seen, right, this tension between the human uses, pulling from the river, and then protecting exactly what John was talking about, the biodiversity, right? And here in Utah, when the reservoir levels went down, a lot of people were really concerned that they couldn't go out on a houseboat. So that was their priority, that the houseboats were docked on Lake Powell, right? And so I don't have a solution for that, but I do agree, again, what's kind of been emphasized is all of those viewpoints should be at least acknowledged and considered, and then the challenge will be how we prioritize and meet the needs. And with our kind of indigenous populations, there isn't quite that same distinction or tension. I think it's a lot of our tribal communities, and again, 574 across our country, 30 in the basin. Every tribe is distinct, but many have similarities in a more holistic approach that if your river and your water systems are unhealthy, your community is unhealthy. You can't practice your traditions, and just kind of seeing those interrelated connections a little bit more. I'm hoping we see that going forward, right? Instead of these kind of distinct categories, that there's more an interrelationship.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Heather. And I'd like to build on that, because to your, you touched on it, but there's 30 indigenous communities in the river basin, and historically they've been excluded from a lot of the discussions. And I think my question for you is, tribes have rights to significant amounts of Colorado River water, and how are they going to be included in the process this time? And how are these impacts of them being excluded continuing to show up even today?
Yeah, and I think, again, people probably are aware that estimates put it at about like 25% or so, depending on what averages you're looking at. And so those are significant rights. And in the background you provided, right, those prior negotiations, the compact, certainly tribes were not included. But I think just briefly, it's really important for everyone to recognize where those water rights are stemming from, and that they're connected to this history in our country of removal of Native people to take land that was more valuable and give it to white settlers, and establishing these reservations as permanent homelands for the tribe and their tribal members. And you can't have a permanent homeland without water. Just the implications, not just for public health, but economic development. I mean, it's critical to their survival of communities. And really encourage people to dive into this a little bit more if you're not as familiar with the history in our country with Indigenous people. But it's not just the federal government that had these policies. Many states did as well, with the intention of taking away tribal futures, right? Read the Department of Interior's report that they released about boarding schools, right? It was the policy that Native people would die off, and we just wouldn't have to deal with this Indian problem anymore. And so that's the history that we're coming into. And so when we look at how do we include tribes now, I don't think anyone really knows, because it hasn't been done. And so it's a process that's going to, not just be looking to tribes, how do we include you? But the flip side of the state and local and federal governments, how do we do a better job? And there's some work out there that talks about effective tribal consultation. What does that mean? You know, really for me, I think it's not just having that seat at the table, the opportunity for tribes to give their opinion, their voice, identify what their needs are, but tribes also have to be empowered with the information to effectively engage, right? Like as an attorney, I would never show up at a mediation without planning, without having the information I need to negotiate and discuss things. And because of that past history, tribal capacity for many tribes has been significantly diminished, and there's a lot of catching up that needs to be done. And that's what groups like the Water and Tribe Initiative are doing, is helping tribes be in a better position for this really first time ever engaging, being part of that discussion. So
Yeah, it's a lot of work for everyone. Thank you for that. So Mark, I want to go back to you and think about, how do we build more flexible, adaptable management systems to match sort of the unprecedented times? And as Colby mentioned, if we're looking at something in the order of 30% reduction of water use across the entire basin, what are the systems that we can build to manage that in a more flexible, adaptable way?
Well, I'm going to make a pretty limited admittedly parochial response to that question. So please follow up as required. But I think a quick answer here is the one thing that achieves flexible and adaptable management systems is we have to recognize that rather than a one-size-fits-all policy plan, flexible and adaptable, geographically specific participation in supporting basin-wide water management solutions are going to be critical. There's just very little other way to consider palatable and politically palatable solutions. And I would submit that this is going to require some uncomfortable leaps of faith on the part of state, regional, federal water managers to help identify, support, and sustain innovative, localized thinking and actions. I think we've heard those messages loud and clear, and we think it can't be done without that recognition. So I'll leave that at that point.
All right, so more local solutions. I guess speaking just from your own experience, what do you think would work in the Grand Valley or in Western Colorado? Are there opportunities there that you think would help in that local sense?
Oh, now you're not being fair here. So but a couple of things, and we're if we have time, I know there's some questions coming up that may address this, but the process kind of starts with some thinking. So in order to suggest the things that might work, and there's no way that we can get into specifics of what might work right here, other than we know that there's many things that won't work, is that any kinds of programs that would require permanent separation of the water from the land is a non-starter for everybody's benefit. So we've begun to kind of think about some of the things that from a values perspective and from an economic perspective, how do we begin to think about things that would be acceptable to our organization, its members, our friends, our neighbors, and still might have some benefit on the river? So the solutions are going to have to be economically, environmentally, and agronomically sustainable for individual farmers and ranchers, as well as for the organizations like ours that serve their water needs. So we know what some of the characteristics of successful programs might be. We worked through our system conservation pilot program, was successful in determining the scalability and the willingness of farmers to participate. And with proper inducement, proper protection of their interests and the interests of their friends and neighbors, aunts and uncles, it's possible. But it has to be highly variable, and it will vary in some cases farm to farm. So the challenge then is to find these things that make some benefit, but that don't have unintended unrecognized negative consequences for everybody else. So that's the way that we answer those questions when they come to us, is that there's many things that might work. There's some we know absolutely won't. But they have to tick those boxes, beginning with no permanent separation of the water from the land.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. So thinking about solutions and looking in the much more near term, Colby, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we meet the short-term requirements that the Bureau of Reclamation have now said are necessary in 2023, because that's no small ask.
I think it's going to be a little counter to what Mark just said, but it's pain. There is no part of cutting your use by that much that's not painful. There's just not that much low-hanging fruit in the basin. And there's not that much in any one sector that can be easily cut. There's not simple things or billions of dollars of money to offset the entire financial burden of those cuts. So I am heartfelt and serious when I say it's pain. Southern Nevada has been doing really painful, challenging things to ensure that we can continue to keep our water use down. Just last week, we passed a limitation on pool sizes, 600 square feet. We had over an hour of public comment from the pool industry on that, as you can imagine. 2 meetings before that, we put a limitation on golf courses, water budgets, lowering their water budgets to 4 acre feet per acre. Any farmer knows growing grass on 4 acre feet per acre in the Las Vegas Valley, where it's 110 degrees, is not easy. But that's the limit of our golf courses right now, and they're doing it successfully. We have no turf allowed in new development except schools, parks, and cemeteries. Those are things that for people outside of our community think are very easy and make sense. But let me tell you, as the person that has to sell the public and elected officials on changing the way of life, and convincing people that they're not losing quality of life by making these changes is very, very difficult. And that is going to be true for every single water user in the basin. The priority system is not equitable. The way that tribal water rights are managed within the priority system is not equitable. The way that the environment is treated on this river is not equitable. And if we continue to try and follow priority water rights in the resolution of this, we are just going to fall flat on our face. The junior priority users across the basin are largely all municipalities. You can wipe out all of the major municipalities on the river, and you still don't come up with 2 to 4 million acre feet of water. So the solution has to involve agriculture. And agriculture has done a good job voluntarily up until now. But we have not seen large scale participation by agriculture. And we have a really hard time cracking the shell on large scale participation by agriculture, especially in a permanent way. And when you look at, 2 to 4 million is what the Secretary's office has lined out for this year. That's what we have to do every single year going forward, and maybe even more than that. And I think that's what people are losing when we sit at the table right now saying, nope, that's not a high enough price. Nope, I'm not willing to do that. I'm only willing to do this. Temporary compensated, blah, 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 is a really good talking point for your local community. But it's a very unrealistic for us actually being able to manage the system to the amount of water we're being provided. Everybody is going to have to do really painful things, or the federal government's going to prescribe them to us.
Yeah, there's just not that much water in the river. So thank you, Colby. And Mark, I do want to pivot to you, back to you again, because, Colby brought up the point that how much water the municipalities use across the basin and how significant agriculture is when we're talking about these kinds of cuts. So I just want to give you an opportunity if you wanted to add anything on the role that you see agriculture playing and contributing to the solution.
Well, thank you. And this is not, I think it's fair to say, I mean, all of us in agriculture recognize we do understand or try to understand the math, and the math matters for sure, whether it's within our basin or within our organizations. We think that in our, and this is coming from our association and from me personally, I wouldn't necessarily say that everyone shares in this belief, but it's our belief that the best way to protect our interests at the water users and in the Grand Valley are to recognize the legitimate needs of others. Doesn't mean that we're going to capitulate where we shouldn't, or that we have to make sacrifices that don't make sense, that don't help solve a long-term solution. But we ignore the benefit that we can bring to our own needs for participation and protection and potentially profitability by ignoring the larger issues and the needs that are out there. So we think that agriculture does indeed have a role in addressing these problems. Probably what that exactly looks like, I think it's a little bit like Heather mentioned, is that there's certainly some new ground here. There's some new territory. But that if we don't have a role, we lose. That if we want to maintain, I mentioned in a presentation a few months ago that probably the lack of transparency and sometimes the inequitable situations on the river, agriculture has been the beneficiary of some of those things. We can't take those things for granted anymore, that it's just going to work out for agriculture. We have to participate in a meaningful, productive way in this conversation, or we lose by default. So I think most people are beginning to recognize that it's a little bit like upper basin participation in the long-term solutions, is no matter how firmly we believe that some heavy lifting has to be done by the lower basin, there's overlapping upper basin issues that we have to think about as well. So it would be very difficult to assume that we can ignore the needs of large municipalities in the West. We just overlap too dramatically with those needs to say, no, go pound sand, Kobe. It doesn't matter. It won't work, and it does matter. So I apologize for the editorializing there, but we think that it's in our best interest to try to participate productively.
So thank you, Mark. More painful collaboration. Kobe, do you want to jump back in?
And I'm just going to say that I think the role of agriculture is very different in the lower basin than it is in the upper basin. The way agriculture has to respond, the way that water is being used is different in the upper basin and the lower basin. We're seeing high elevation agriculture diminish naturally because of climate change. And so there's this completely different dynamic. There's also very different levels of control. The secretary can step in and manage every single water user in the lower basin for health and human safety. It's not that straightforward in the upper basin. The secretary does not have that same role. So, the solutions are different. And I wholeheartedly agree with Mark. The lower basin has to get their shit together and use less water.
Great, thanks, Colby. So Mark mentioned long-term solutions. We've been talking about the immediate short-term crisis. So John and Heather, I'd love to get your thoughts on how do decision makers balance this sort of tension between all the work that needs to be done in the short term and the need for long-term strategic action, including on the interim guidelines. John, do you want to jump in there?
Sure, and I'll just say that Colby's comment on how painful this is going to be is really testing the limits of my optimism, but I'm holding strong. Implied in your question, Orla, we have to do both, right? We cannot kick the can down the road with the longer term systemic fixes that we need while taking care of these short-term emergency responses. We have to do both. Avoiding the system from crashing in the next year or two is important, but just as important is finding ways to reduce the uses that Colby was talking about and finding these long-term fixes, how we use less water overall. And so taking those lessons learned from the short-term crisis management and applying those to long-term actions, I think, is really important. You know, what we've seen with these short-term crisis management is how quickly things can change and how quickly we need to respond. And so this gets back to the comment about how flexible and adaptive we need our governance to be on this river. You know, historically, shortage criteria is based on elevation levels and how quickly the system can move. I think we should think about additional ways or additional criteria for making those shortage determinations. Things like looking at the recent hydrology of the river and not just reservoir levels is one way to have a more flexible and responsive management and proactive management regime as well. And I think also in terms of not of balancing both short and long term, despite the pain that Colby mentioned, like we sort of know what to do. It's a political problem. We know we need to reduce less water, but it's a political challenge of how to actually implement it. A lot of my work is in the municipal sector, and we know what to do. And I often refer folks to what Colby's agency is doing, because if more and more of our municipalities were doing what Southern Nevada is doing, we would be in a much better spot in the municipal sector. And things like outdoor efficiency, turf replacement programs, banning non-functional turf, thinking about your land use planning and water efficiency and water reuse, water recycling. There's all these things we can be doing. Again, as Colby mentioned, it's a political challenge, but I think because we know what we need to be doing and using less water, we can start to do that as soon as possible, despite the pain. And so I think there are ways to balance the short-term decision-making and the long-term actions that we all know are needed.
Yeah, and I think the two things I would add on top of that is, you know, we really need to be careful in the actions we take to address a short-term crisis, that we're not actually implementing some long-term permanent harm, right? And again, I think this goes back to kind of the impacts on the environment and biodiversity. And when we look at kind of the immediate actions to take right now, we focus on the water use that's coming out, people's individual uses, curtailing that supply. And there's an opportunity to turn to kind of related areas in a more long-term strategic plan of, you know, okay, we know climate change is reducing, increasing droughts, affecting supply, right? As an individual in your household, maybe there's not a lot of changes you can make to your individual water use, but, you know, let's connect this to climate change, cut out meat once a week, right? And that's going to have an impact for our longer term. And across the United States, our infrastructure is horrible. You know, Society of Engineers gives us like a D+. And so due to poor infrastructure, we're losing, I think it's like 6 billion gallons of water a day, just right out of these pipes that are old. And so there's other areas that sometimes I think we get so narrowed in on what's in, you know, what's our individual water use here, that, but we need to be a little creative and take advantage of maybe what might become some of these easier wins, right? Big money invested in infrastructure with IJA. And so hopefully that will address it. We can get some water savings here. Just every little thing I think we need to take advantage of.
There's definitely some opportunities to take advantage of those now. So thanks, Heather. Appreciate that. So I think I'd like to ask all the panelists, you know, what do you think success looks like in the interim guidelines, you know, when we get there in 2026? Mark, do you want to kick us off? Give us your thoughts on what you think successful renegotiation of the interim guidelines would look like.
Well, I think that what success to many of us is going to look like, and you know, it's hard to avoid a self-serving, somewhat mercenary perspective here, but some sort of sustainable balance that includes all of agriculture, the environment, municipalities, and the tribes that sustain us all. You know, the importance of food production, of course, is important, but the sustenance of the values that agricultural water use brings to all of us is a value that we won't have the right answer if we don't make that possible. Our efforts should not be construed to find ways to make every agricultural opportunity profitable, but we should never, our long-term goal, and we think that a piece of success would be guidelines that keep the system from collapsing, but also support the ability to farm and range in the future with the land and the water that it takes to do that. What those operations will look like, we'll have to leave that up to the folks that do them. But that's what success would look like for us.
Thank you, Mark. Heather, what would success look like from your perspective?
Really good question. I think what I'm really hoping to see is the establishment of better relationships. Again, the first time we're seeing across the basin, all the states acknowledging, yes, tribes should be a part of this. And how do we improve our tribal relations within our states? Not a lot of states have established consultation policies, and we're starting to see more movement in that area. And again, like water is so critical and important, but I think if we establish those partnerships and those relationships, it will go out into other related areas as well, like the climate change, adaptations and mitigation strategies, just public health in general. And, a lot of my work has focused on this human right to water, securing it. And one of the wonderful things about COVID and this climate change, if you can take kind of a silver lining out of it, is that there was a commitment and recognition by everyone, including the Western States Water Council, that tribal communities lack clean water access. They should have clean water access, and that's separate and should be fulfilled aside from kind of quantification of remaining water rights. And so yeah, again, the end result, I don't know, but I think this process that we're going through, I do see a lot of hope for just getting a little restorative justice here of actions that states and federal government have done to tribes and how we heal and work together, not just in water, but kind of all areas as neighbors and, things like that.
As humans. Thank you, Heather. Colby, what does success look like from your perspective?
I think it's like surviving a weekend with your extended family. Everybody's a little grumpy with everybody else, but we're still willing to sit down at that final barbecue and break some bread and share together. Because it's going to be ugly. And I think that's, maybe building on what Heather said about relationships, like getting to a place where we can do really hard things that require really big sacrifices, yet still be willing to stand up and support them. I'm skeptical about that. The river has been hallmarked by cooperation. A number of people and users that cooperation inherently has to evolve is expanding. But everything we've done to date has been a situation where there's some carrots and some sticks, where there's some rewards for taking some pain, where lower basin users got the ability to store water in exchange for agreeing to take a modest amount of shortages. There's nothing left to give on this river. So coming up with a solution where everyone has to do less is going to be really challenging. I think the more granular hallmarks of success are being bold enough to create a management policy that addresses all reservoir levels. We've sort of been stuck in this, we're going to bite off the politically palatable portion of the elephant and we're going to punt on the rest. And that's why we've had to do 2007 Interim Guidelines, an MOU, the System Conservation Plan, the DCP, and now 2 to 4 million acre feet more, is because nobody's ever been bold enough to take on the entire amount of risk. And the entire amount of risk is really scary. But I think that's another hallmark of success, is being willing to actually look at what it takes to manage the reservoir at all levels and under future climate change projections. And the other thing I'll say is undoubtedly this next chapter of the Colorado River Guidelines is going to require legislation. I don't see how we get to a point that doesn't. And I think the real hallmark of success is being able to show up in Congress with support from the 7 states, support from agricultural water users, support from municipal water users, support from the tribes, and support from the NGOs. And are we ever going to have 100% support from anyone? No, that's unrealistic. But getting, you know, a lot of people in each of those sectors to be willing to stand up and say, we've taken a lot of painful actions here, and I feel like the amount of pain I'm taking is equitable enough to everyone else that I'm willing to do it. I think that's the hallmark of success.
Thank you, Colby. John, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I know we're short on time, but what I was planning on saying is mostly being covered by Mark, Heather, and Colby. And that I think there's process success and outcome success. In process success is we truly have a participatory, transparent process that folks are not just heard, but actually their voices are considered, their ideas are included in the new guidelines. And then on the outcome, I wholeheartedly agree with everything that Colby just said. The only thing I would add to it is we have to take the big, bold actions to bring the system not just back into balance and equilibrium, but going beyond that. We need to develop a system that isn't just about demands meeting supplies. It's about being proactive, about making sure that the river itself has enough water. And you only get there if you're not just achieving equilibrium, but you're actually moving beyond that, and you're doing the big, bold actions to take care of the river itself. And so a pathway for that is something that I would think is success in 2026.
Thank you, John. That's great. So I know we only have a few minutes left. We do have some questions from the audience, so I'm gonna pivot over to some of those. So the first question is, will there be water for ecological flows as part of the new 2026 management guidelines? Not just the Grand Canyon, but for both basins as well. If not, what will the effect be on the biodiversity that the river has supported, and what portions of the river will be dried up or face significantly reduced flows? John, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can jump in quickly. That I hope so. I hope that we are considering ecological flows as part of this new guidelines that we'll be developing, and part of that is identifying which parts of the river and its tributaries are most vulnerable, what needs to happen, and then, like I was saying earlier, finding ways to integrate that into these responses, into the framework, into the shortage criteria, into reservoir reoperations, into all these other mechanisms that we use to protect water users. We need to integrate water for the river itself into those same mechanisms. So at a very high level, I think that's my hope, at least for the 2026 guidelines.
Great, thanks, John. The next question relates to Southern Utah, considered the fastest growing area in the country. There is pushback by many about water conservation because they see it going to promote growth at their own expense. This gets to the point made by Colby that all must give and suffer some. So just interested in additional reactions to that. I don't know if Heather is the Utah president or Colby, want to weigh in again?
I'll just say, you know, our stance has always been, and I don't think it changes very much, that water conservation is a community-based decision for the sacrifices that they want to make. If a community has a no growth policy, they probably don't need a water conservation policy. If a community has 100% water reuse, they probably don't need indoor water conservation as much as they need outdoor water conservation. I think that, you know, there's a lot of, you could place a lot of scrutiny on almost any community in the Colorado River Basin for their failure to do things or their failure to do them quickly enough. But most of those decisions are motivated based upon how much water rights they have and the cost of doing conservation. If it's cheap, that's an easy sell. If you have unused water under your allocation and it's really expensive to do water conservation, that's much harder to get elected officials to press green buttons on. I think the reality is every single community needs to be using realistic climate change projections when they look at their use, not what their water rights are. Southern Nevada is the only municipal agency that can consistently boast using less water than its allocation and continuing to double down on conservation. And that's because our forward planning looks at an 11 million acre foot future on the Colorado River. Everyone needs to be realistic in looking at what climate change is going to produce from these rivers, not what their paper water rights show.
Thanks, Colby.
Yeah, I mean, and people can Google about, if they haven't already or be aware of it, right? The Lake Powell kind of pipeline controversy. St. George is a very growing community in southern Utah. So it's our southwestern side of the state, not so much our southeastern part, which, surprise, surprise, that's where Navajo Nation is, right? When saying they're expanding out their infrastructure. But I think this again goes back to really encouraging, like, every average American should understand these challenges with water. What are their uses, you know, and this is part of the discussion, same things people throw out of, should we have limits on the number of kids? Can we sustain our population, right? What kind of food are we growing? Like, they're all things to consider. How much is it going to really get pushed, right? Americans can choose to live where they want to live right now. We don't really put limitations on that. Should those be part of discussions? I don't know. We could really go on and get into all sorts of tangents on this, but I think it's, again, just bringing them into the discussion and talking about them. So at least you're considering them, I think, is important.
Thanks, Heather. And so we're at time. We're actually a little over. So thank you all so much for your participation today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Orla and Western Resource Advocates, for having us. Appreciate it.
And I'm just going to turn it over to Jen to wrap up for us.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all the panelists. It was a really important, great conversation. Thank you, Orla, for moderating, and thank you all for attending. Watch out for the webinar recording. As I mentioned, it'll hit your email in the next couple of days, and it'll also be posted to our website under the webinar section. And just one final plug, if you are interested in supporting WRA's Healthy Rivers work or other on-the-ground climate solutions, please visit westernresourceadvocates.org/donate. I hope to see you again on a future webinar. Have a great day.